Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 11 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 11. Now, of course, we have 4 teams on bye, which consist of the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Miami Dolphins, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Seattle Seahawks. So if, in fact, you need a stash option that could potentially be a streaming option going forward, the players that I mentioned on today's episode should definitely be able to help with that. But the main purpose of talking about Week 11 waiver wire targets is to acquire players that are coming off of weeks that can build momentum and continue that for the remainder of the 2022 season, and of course help us win a 2022 fantasy football championship. A lot of players had big breakout performances that going forward should be able to help our lineups, and quite frankly are not rostered in many leagues. Over the course of today's episode, I'm never going to mention a singular player as a potential option that is rostered in more than 50% of Yahoo leagues. I want players that have high availability, so you can go ahead, hit your waiver wires, acquire players that can help you for the weeks ahead. Now, of course, a lot of the waiver wire pickups that we usually talk about on a weekly basis have to do with injuries that took place as well. We're talking about Cooper Kupp going down with an injury, Zach Ertz season-ending knee injury, absolutely brutal. Juju Smith-Schuster dealing with a pretty major concussion. Jerry Jeudy with an ankle sprain, which obviously is probably going to keep him out for some sort of time. Justin Herbert last night dealt with a concussion. Leonard Fournette dealing with a hip. Obviously, he's going to the bye week, so we're going to have to wait and see how he kind of transpires throughout that. And of course, Khalil Herbert also dealing with an injury. So there's a lot of players that are in question who also have prospects behind them that can step up and make plays for the weeks ahead. Either way, before we begin, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season for the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, take 2 seconds out of your day, do yourself a favor, and subscribe down below. Thank you very much. After tonight's Monday Night Football game between the Philadelphia Eagles and Washington Commanders, be sure to swing on by to the channel. We'll be live streaming here from about 8:15 to 10:15 Pacific Standard Time. So if you're interested in asking questions in regards to trades and or waiver wire pickups going into Week 11, be sure to swing on by, ask some questions, join the community, all that kind of stuff will be here. Also, speaking of the Monday Night Football game, for those of you who want to get more action on a weekly basis via daily fantasy, be sure to check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description of the video. For those of you who want to play more daily fantasy, of course, picking more or less on a given player statistic, be sure to check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. And when you use promo code Andrew today and sign up and make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So they double your first-time deposit up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out. I will be mentioning a couple entries at the end of today's episode. So for those of you who are interested, check out the timestamps down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, with all that covered, let's go ahead and let's talk about the running back position. First and foremost, I do want to mention as a preface, if in fact Elijah Mitchell is available in your league, I know he's currently rostered in 58% of Yahoo formats, but if Elijah Mitchell somehow, someway is available, coming off of 18 rushing attempts last night, for 9.3 fantasy points, had himself 89 rushing yards against the Los Angeles Chargers run-stop defense that, of course, can't stop anybody. But if, in fact, Elijah Mitchell is available, please be sure to acquire him off the waivers. I don't think he should be available, but if he is, go for him. Either way, outside of him, let's talk about players that probably could be available in your league. We're talking about Rachaad White. Now, I've mentioned Rachaad White for probably 4, 5, 6 weeks now, consecutively as a guy that you want to pick up. He's currently rostered in 44% of Yahoo formats. He's coming off of a week in which he had 22 rushing attempts and 105 rushing yards. And you may be thinking, Andrew, yes, he was able to get over double-digit fantasy points because of Leonard Fournette's hip injury, but that's not the truth. When I went back and I watched that game from the beginning, you saw that in the first play of the game, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers starting running back was Rachaad White. And in fact, he was given the first rushing attempt of the game. He seems to me like he's very easily carving out a role within this offense. And like we've talked about over the last couple of weeks with Leonard Fournette, he's not only carving out a role, but he's dominating this backfield in terms of the efficiency of rushing attempts. Now, from what we've heard over the last couple hours is that Leonard Fournette's hip injury isn't going to hold him out for any, certain amount of time. But it doesn't mean that Rachaad White is going to give him back the, wide majority of rushing attempts in this backfield. I think there's a very good chance that both these guys continue to rotate. Leonard Fournette most likely being a third down back as a more efficient pass blocker and receiving back in this offense. But it doesn't mean that Rachaad White can't dominate all 3 downs of this backfield if Leonard Fournette continues to be inefficient within this offense. Moving on to Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco came out, was the primary running back, and outside of him, he had 16 rushing attempts, by the way. Outside of him, Jerick McKinnon and Clyde Edwards-Helaire each only had one rushing attempt in Week 10 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. It was a one-sided affair, and even after Isiah Pacheco fumbled the ball, on the next drive, he came back out, and he was given the rushing attempts. This team does not want to trust Clyde Edwards-Helaire in any sort of capacity, and they are not giving him touches. Jerick McKinnon, Isiah Pacheco, they are the clear number 1 and 2 of this backfield going forward. And when we're talking about one of the most favorable strength of schedules in the fantasy playoffs, the Kansas City Chiefs have that with their starting running backs, of course, specifically Isiah Pacheco, if he continues to reign majority of the running attempts in his direction. Specifically taking on Houston in Week 15, Week 16 is the Seattle Seahawks matchup, and Week 17, the championship game, is against the Denver Broncos. All 3 favorable matchups where we can absolutely see Isiah Pacheco dominate. Currently only rostered in 24% of leagues. I'm hoping he gets more goal line opportunity. It's probably going to be unlikely, but either way, still has value for breakout potential. Got a lot of speed with his legs. Moving on. Talking about Gus Edwards coming off of the bye week. If in fact Gus Edwards is available, currently rostered in only 48% of Yahoo leagues. If he's available, why not go ahead and give him another opportunity here? Because we still know that J.K. Dobbins is slow to return. And if Gus Edwards is going to get the primary back role over Kenyon Drake going against the Carolina Panthers of all defenses, it is a defense that we have certainly seen, whether it's Joe Mixon and or the Atlanta Falcons, find themselves a lot of success in terms of running the ball. I know the Atlanta Falcons this last Thursday weren't as efficient as they were in Week 8 against that defense. But we've certainly seen the running back position certainly dominate against the Carolina Panthers. I can absolutely see Gus Edwards coming back from the hamstring doing as such. Moving on to Jaylen Warren. Now, even though Jaylen Warren found himself 9.2 fantasy points with the 12 total touches he was given, I do want to mention this is the first time all season we have seen Najee Harris get 20 rushing attempts in a given game, which is obviously progression from what we've seen earlier in the year. That all being said, Jaylen Warren still only rostered in 27% of leagues, got himself 9 rushing attempts for 37 yards, 3 catches on 3 targets, 40 receiving yards. He's continuing to put up high number of points. Back-to-back weeks of 9 fantasy points continues to lean us in his direction in terms of a back that could honestly be in that RB3 range going forward with the amount of opportunities he's continuing to receive. Moving on to Jerick McKinnon. Speaking of receiving opportunities, Jerick McKinnon in each of the last 2 weeks has had himself 8 targets and 6 catches, back-to-back weeks. And with those overall opportunities, he's delivering, getting himself 56 receiving yards in one game and 40 in the other. When we're talking about a full PPR scoring format, that means he has surpassed 10 fantasy points in each of the last 2 games that he has played with receiving statistics alone. When we talk about this offense, obviously leaning away from Clyde Edwards-Helaire and towards Isiah Pacheco as a starting running back role and rushing attempts going in his direction, the receiving role is 100% dominated by Jerick McKinnon. And if you're in a full PPR scoring format and are in desperate need of running back help, I believe Jerick McKinnon can very easily fill into that role and help you out on a weekly basis. Moving on, let's talk about our number 6, Isaiah Spiller. The reason why I wanted to mention him is because, again, I've talked about a lot of waiver wire handcuff options already on today's episode. And that's typically what we're going to find. We have to find players that we can add to our roster that, yes, may not make immediate sense, but going into the remainder of the season, their insurance policies for our running backs. If we're expecting Austin Ekeler to continue this level of success, getting himself, 6-7 plus receptions every single game, obviously getting the bulk majority of the rushing attempts, if anything was to ever happen with him, that's so much value that is available in a singular backfield. I would want to have his handcuff on my roster immediately. Again, he's only rostered in 4% of leagues, and we all know that Austin Ekeler is rostered in 100% of leagues. So 96% of you who have Austin Ekeler have already made a mistake by not having Isaiah Spiller on your bench and insured just in case, because if something happens to your best prospect, your chances of winning a championship, they obviously go down at a significant margin. That's why we want to pick up Isaiah Spiller. Moving on, let's talk about the wide receiver position, and perhaps the position that may be actually more valuable in the long run when we talk about these specific players. Number 1, Christian Watson, currently only rostered in 8% of leagues. We know what kind of an athlete he is. I mean, once he came out of college, we knew he was in the 99th percentile in a lot of specific things, whether it's size, speed, talent. Like, he has it all. We knew this, right? But it was just a matter of, can he make that transition with Aaron Rodgers, who typically does not trust his rookie wide receivers? And throughout the course of the first 9 weeks, obviously, it didn't pan out for Christian Watson. The first game of the season, dropped a 75-yard receiving touchdown. Obviously, that was an unfortunate scenario, but after week 1, having played the second most wide receiver snaps in that singular game, he started dealing with injuries. And then those started to pile on. He started missing weeks. He started getting less opportunities within a given week. And then we got to ourselves pretty much phasing away Christian Watson. And now that we're back into a conversation where Christian Watson, his 4.36 speed, his 6'4", just physical stature, his 38.5-inch vertical leap, these all taking into account, he's one of the most ridiculous wide receivers in terms of athleticism in the National Football League. And when you, of course, pair him up with one of the best quarterbacks when he's playing well, you got yourself a recipe for success. 8 targets, 4 catches, 107 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, 30.7 half PPR fantasy points last night against the Dallas Cowboys defense. All in all, Christian Watson could have very easily had a 4th receiving touchdown, but they're going to work on that. And he's only going to get better going forward. He's absolutely, in my opinion, the number 1 or 2 option going into this week in terms of waiver wire priority. Moving on to Parris Campbell, our number 2 at the wide receiver position. Considering the fact that out of absolutely nowhere, Matt Ryan is now the starting quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts, it changed everything. It purely did. Going from Sam Ehlinger to Matt Ryan absolutely presents far more value to the receiving core of the Indianapolis Colts, and mainly Parris Campbell. Let me remind you guys, prior to Matt Ryan being benched, the last 2 games that we saw from Parris Campbell was 15.2 fantasy points and 18.0 fantasy points. In both those games, was able to get himself over 10 targets and a touchdown. Now, this didn't really change from this last week, as Matt Ryan targeted him 9 times for 7 receptions, 76 receiving yards and a touchdown, 17.1 fantasy points. So in the course of the last 3 games that Parris Campbell has played with a starting Matt Ryan, he has scored 15 fantasy points in each of those 3 games. Going forward, a guy that's only rostered in 18% of leagues absolutely needs to be picked up, because this offense looks significantly better than we anticipated. And the fact that Matt Ryan is back under center as the starter for sure for the remainder of the year, it looks like we're going to get a lot of opportunity going in Parris Campbell's direction. And the primary reason is because Matt Ryan completed only 3 passes of 10 or more yards down the field. Only had 5 attempts, 10 or more yards down the field. And he was 21 for 28 passing. So that means the wide majority of his passing attempts are very close to the line of scrimmage, and why not to your slot receiver by Parris Campbell. Moving on to Kadarius Toney, our number 3. Considering we have a couple injuries taking place within the offense of the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, Kadarius Toney has a lot of value. Currently, he's only rostered in 51% of leagues. I don't typically like to mention players that are in that 50% range, but I have to mention him just in case he's available. Again, he's coming off a week in which he scored a touchdown, had 17 fantasy points, and because of the absence of McCole Hardman due to the abdomen injury, and of course Juju Smith-Schuster going down with a concussion, he was given more and more opportunity within this offense. 4 catches, 2 rushing attempts, had himself over 80 total yards and a touchdown. That kind of production, if they continue to utilize him in a sense, whether it's in the slot role, out wide, out of the backfield, does not matter. He has a lot of value considering the offense that he's primarily associated with going forward. Moving on to Donovan Peoples-Jones. Again, another consecutive week of mentioning him. Just to kind of give you some perspective, obviously he's rostered in 35% of leagues, so people are finally beginning to pick it up and find Donovan Peoples-Jones on their waivers available. But since week 4, these are his overall production numbers. 5 catches for 71, 4 for 50, 4 for 74, 6 for 71, 4 for 81, and 5 for 99 this past week. Imagine he's putting up these incredible numbers of about 8 to 12 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format over the course of the last 6 games. And not only that, he's only going to improve when Deshaun Watson returns to the starting lineup. Moving on to Nico Collins, our number 5. Nico Collins is coming off a week in which he was the primary number 1 receiver of this offense. Of course, Brandon Cooks cannot be trusted, and that's the primary reason why on Sunday morning yesterday, while we were doing our live stream, I completely removed them off of our rankings list because I just don't trust Brandon Cooks anymore. Nico Collins comes in, steps up, 10 targets, 5 catches, 49 yards, and a touchdown. If we're going to continue to see him be the primary number 1 of this offense, and Brandon Cooks is going to play a more limited role, Nico Collins has himself a lot of value and potential upside, currently only rostered in 13% of Yahoo leagues. Moving on to Darius Slayton. Darius Slayton somehow, some way, has a knack for finding the end zone. He's been able to score 3 touchdowns in like the last 4 weeks here. Now, it doesn't mean that there's going to be another guarantee for success going into this week, but they do take on the Detroit Lions. And if we're looking at who the primary number 1 wide receiver of this offense is, it is clearly Darius Slayton when we compare him to Wan'Dale Robinson and Kenny Golladay. So going forward, a wide receiver that's only rostered in 6% of leagues, taking on an advantageous matchup against the Detroit Lions, why not go ahead, fire him up? I understand that his reception for a touchdown this last week was on a couple broken tackles, but again, I'm not taking that away from him. I think that's an incredible play that he made, and he can certainly continue to make more as the season progresses. Moving on, I just want to mention DeAndre Carter as a potential flex 6 to 7 option at the wide receiver position, mainly because if in fact Keenan Allen does not return from his injury, there's a lot of potential for success from DeAndre Carter. We saw him with Justin Herbert be a perfect option. Unfortunately, once Justin Herbert left the game with an injury, it definitely impacted the overall value of DeAndre Carter. But if we're not going to see Keenan Allen, suit up and get ready for this Kansas City game, DeAndre Carter could have a lot of value. Let's move on to the tight end position. Talking about Juwan Johnson, our number 1. Juwan Johnson has had 4 receiving touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. But in the last 4 weeks, he only has 14 receptions. His touchdown rate is unbelievably high as of late, but he's also coming off of weeks in which he's getting high target counts. 7 targets, 5 catches, 44 yards, and a touchdown this last week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Going forward, could have more and more value within this offense, considering how much utilization he's continuing to get down into the red zone. Again, the New Orleans Saints over the course of the last couple of weeks have been extremely inefficient in terms of running the ball. So that means no Taysom Hill, that means no Alvin Kamara, and if they're continuing to have to pass the ball, Juwan Johnson, absolutely an option down in the red zone. Moving on to our number 2 at the tight end position, it is Tyler Conklin, coming off of the bye week. The reason why we want to mention Tyler Conklin is because the last time he took on the New England Patriots, which again, he has the privilege of taking on this week, was in week 8. He had 10 targets, 6 catches, 79 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's 22.9 half PPR fantasy points. It's a very advantageous matchup for him, and if they're going to continue to exploit what they did the last time they took on this team, currently only rostered in 14% of leagues, could be a great option. Moving on to our final option here at tight end, it is Foster Moreau. With Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow on the injured reserve, that opens up a lot of receiving opportunity within this offense. Obviously, we do expect Josh Jacobs and Devontae Adams to get theirs, and Mac Hollins maybe was going to step up, but hasn't really shown as such over the course of the last 2 games. Yet Foster Moreau continues to get himself a high target volume and, of course, some work down in the red zone. If, in fact, he's going to continue to pair up those targets, find himself in the end zone. He could have had himself a second receiving touchdown in that game. If those targets continue to go in his direction, could be a great option. Let's move on to the quarterback position, beginning with our number 1, Marcus Mariota. Coming off a pretty efficient week last week against the Carolina Panthers. Again, he put up 2 pretty good games against them this season. Now, when we talk about the potential of him against the Chicago Bears, it mainly has to do with the fact that the Chicago Bears cannot stop anyone defensively over the course of the last month. In the last 3 games, they've given up 49 points to the Cowboys. They've given up 35 points to the Dolphins and 31 points to the Detroit Lions. Every single offense they've taken on over the course of the last 3 games has dominated them. I don't put that past Marcus Mariota. I'm expecting him to have himself another one of these big games, whether it's on the ground, through the air. Should be a great play. Moving on to Matt Ryan. Again, a surprise start on Sunday. Even though Jeff Saturday, just a week prior was saying, yes, Sam Ehlinger is going to be the starting quarterback, we saw Matt Ryan come out and play well. If Matt Ryan is going to continue to be a 200-plus yards in the passing game category with 2 touchdowns, whether it is on the ground or through the air, we'll take that. He had himself 4 rushing attempts for 38 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Obviously, the rushing touchdown was a QB sneak. And of course, the 38 rushing yards were all gathered on a singular play because the defense just completely crumbled. But either way, even though those numbers are not going to be consistent in the rushing category, I do expect him to be a primary passer in an offense that looked a lot better than we anticipated. And going forward should show a lot of heart. Moving on to our number 3, we have Ryan Tannehill. To be honest, even though he wasn't extremely efficient, only a 53% passing completion percentage, he played relatively well in terms of fantasy purposes against a pretty tough defense in the Denver Broncos. Had himself 255 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Obviously, Nick Ikine Westbrook was able to dominate in terms of that flea flicker for a receiving touchdown and get himself a lot of work down in the deep receiving yard game. If Treylon Burks, Robert Woods start to kind of pick it up going into this week, could be a value going up against the Green Bay Packers defense. Moving on, let's talk about one option that I wanted to mention as a flexible 3/4. It is Deshaun Watson. Again, if he's still available in your league, you should absolutely be picking him up. If in fact you're in need of a quarterback potential play from weeks 13 through 17. Again, he does not come back until week 13 against the Houston Texans and could potentially be of value for the fantasy football playoffs. But you also have to have another player on roster, a quarterback on roster, that is going to be able to get you to week 13 and maybe not even play Deshaun Watson there, because we might want to just wait, let's see what he's capable of, and then move forward with him, because you don't want to automatically start him in the playoffs unless we have a full idea as to what he's capable of. Let's move on to kickers and defenses, beginning with our number 1, Nick Folk. Nick Folk, obviously only rostered in 44% of leagues, needs to have not been dropped last week. If he was dropped in your league, he is one of the major priorities that I want to go ahead and put a waiver in on, whether it's fab and or just general priority in terms of a continual rolling list. When we're talking about Nick Folk's last 2 games, he put up 21 fantasy points and 17 fantasy points. He's made 9 field goals in the last 2 contests. He's the number 4 overall kicker in fantasy. And when we're talking about someone that could very easily average 10 fantasy points per game, that's a huge difference maker, especially when some of our running backs aren't doing that on a weekly basis. Moving on to Greg Zuerlein, also coming off the bye. Since week 2, these are his fantasy point contributions: 9, 18, 6, 8, 9, 12, 5, and 10. He's averaging 10 fantasy points per game since week 2, currently only rostered in 6% of leagues. Moving on to our final kicker, it is Kaimi Fairbairn of the Houston Texans. Kaimi Fairbairn, very similar in terms of this season already. Since week 1, he's averaging 9 fantasy points per game at the kicking position, only rostered in 3% of leagues, coming off of a week of double-digit fantasy points. Would love to potentially see him put up more kicks in an offense that, yes, isn't as capable of scoring touchdowns. Therefore, they settle for field goals. Moving on to the kicker position, we begin with the Baltimore Ravens coming off of the bye. They take on the Carolina Panthers and Baker Mayfield. We have just been given word that PJ Walker is dealing with a high ankle sprain. Baker will be the starter, and if that's going to be the case, they should absolutely dominate against him. Moving on, let's talk about the New York Jets defense. The New York Jets, just to kind of give you guys some perspective, since week 4, these are the fantasy point contributions from this defense: 12, 9, 27, 8, and 10. That's 11 fantasy points per game since week 4, and going forward, I don't expect them to slow down, taking on the New England Patriots this week. The final option is the Washington Commanders. They will take on the Houston Texans in week 11. Now, even though this video is being recorded before the Monday Night Football game between the Philadelphia Eagles and Washington Commanders, and the return of Chase Young could certainly make a difference in terms of this defense as a whole, I still believe that the matchup in itself against the Houston Texans is advantageous for the Washington Commanders, which gives me some hope into potentially picking them up and playing them in this given week. All right, now that we've covered all of this, let's go ahead and transition and talk about the Monday Night Football game in specific, which includes the Washington Commanders, in terms of some entries via PrizePick for tonight. Let's go ahead and check that out. All right, so as you guys can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks, via the NFL section for specifically tonight's game. Now, there are multiple stats that we could talk about, whether it's passing yards, rushing yards, receiving yards, receptions, field goals made, tackles and assists, sacks allowed, fantasy points scored in a full PPR, touchdowns specifically in a general position of one player. But the newest feature from PrizePicks in terms of on a weekly basis going after players is picking receiving and rushing touchdowns between two different players. So you have an even higher potential for opportunity in comparison to talking about just Miles Sanders by himself scoring a touchdown. Can we trust that A.J. Brown and Curtis Samuel could put up a touchdown? We know, A.J. Brown has scored 5 receiving touchdowns in his last 15 receptions. He's catching a touchdown 1 out of every 3 receptions. That level of potential consistency could end up making us put in an entry for him tonight. Honestly, I'm going to tag this and we'll continue on. When we're talking about potential receiving yards in tonight's game, I'm also of the opinion that there are a lot of potential plays here that could go on the more side. Again, we're picking more or less on a given player statistic. So when we see, Dallas Goedert sitting at 45.5, I think this number is very much so capable considering his recent success, not only against the Washington Commanders throughout his career, but specifically against other teams within this offense. So let's go ahead, add Dallas Goedert to this. And quite frankly, that's kind of where I'm leaning towards. I'm looking at a position where I'm going to go ahead, pick more, assume that A.J. Brown can get the job done, and if he's not able to, Curtis Samuel will be able to do so, and Dallas Goedert going more on 45.5 receiving yards will go ahead, put together an entry for tonight's game. In fact, if you guys are looking to go ahead and join, whether it's follow, fade, go after potential other entries, be sure to click on the link down below in the description of the video. When you sign up today, making a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So basically, they double your first-time deposit up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out today. I'm going to go ahead and make an entry, and that's pretty much going to cover it for me today. Now, outside of this specific entry, I've also made another entry yesterday in terms of Devonta Smith going more on his total receptions and Curtis Samuel going more on his total receiving yards. Hopefully those goes through. We're going to have to wait and see. Either way, that's going to cover it for me today. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about running back rankings at a top 36 capacity, talking about matchups, all things running backs. Until then, thank you everybody for watching. Click the like button down below. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.